The fifth South Africa Investment Conference has exceeded the target of 1.2 trillion rand of pledges set in 2018. President Cyril Ramaphosa says investments in South Africa's digital economy have seen a significant growth. Ramaphosa has, however, warned that the electricity crisis, theft and destruction of infrastructure should be addressed urgently. We're now joined by Economist Sifiso Skenjana to find out what this means for you and I. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. So since the first pledges were made 5 years later, or some over 5 years later, South Africa's economy is no better off. The rand has lost its value. South Africa is still the most unequal society in the world, it is said, and you can see it because of the high unemployment rate, the sharp prices of food. Let's not even talk about petrol. And so what does this investment mean, and how has it translated down to the everyday person over the years?
Good afternoon, Judo. I mean, at the risk of sounding a bit of wet cloth, I think I certainly, I recognize the need for us to go on an investment drive and to market our economy, I think, as an investable space. And I think the South African economy is largely quite investable. I think for me, and I'll just kind of take a walk back and say, there's a number of things I think, even on the onset, that were amiss for me, specifically around one, the direction of the investments. And so do we have a sense and say that when we are going on an investment drive, what sectors do we want that investment and what multiplier effects do we expect it to have? And so for the labor structure and the economic structure that we've got, we can't afford to kind of, throw a broad blanket around attracting investments when that investment itself may not necessarily be conducive for the kind of economic structure that we've got. And so to the point you're asking about trickling down, certain types of investment will trickle down naturally, and certain types of investments won't trickle down naturally. And I think that's the first thing. I think we missed an opportunity there to be a lot more deliberate around which sectors do we think will, give us transformative growth in the context of that. I think the second part we must do is the differentiation between operational expenditure, which we often talk about OPEX, versus CAPEX. I think a lot of what's come through in the pledges sometimes is OPEX. And therefore, I think for me, it then suggests that the number itself that is ultimately said to be reached, I think is still a little bit bloated or overstated, given the fact that some of the organizations there are using OPEX as a mechanism to say they are investing in the economy. And then the third part to do is certainly a question around when organizations do pledge, how often or what is the conversion ratio into investment into the economy? And I think those are all the things that for me are still missing in the report back around this investment drive. So that we truly know that when on average 4 out of 10 pledges translate into actual money into the economy, into this sector's got these multiplier effects. These are the things I think for me are still quite missing at a detail level around the investment drive. And I think, I think it just suggests that for me there are quite a few opportunities that are missed in us being able to articulate where we think investment can be transformative for our growth.
Yeah, speaking of transformative growth and missed opportunities, you spoke earlier about sectors of transformative growth, and I think something was said about improving the visa system in South Africa in order to attract not only skills but investment into the country, because if you read the room, it was the same old faces.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the skills mobility thing has also been an interesting challenge, I think, for us as a country and as a region. I mean, if you're a pharmacist in South Africa, you can't operate in Namibia as a pharmacist without having to get an additional license and vice versa. When you look into the East African community, they are able to move within the EAC to be able to, move particularly high skills within that particular region. I think in South Africa and the SADC region, I think there's a big question we must ask about labor mobility, particularly for high-skilled people, and see how well that and we're able to coordinate ourselves around that. And so I think that's one of the things. The second one, I think, again, around the conference itself, I think there's policy cohesion. I mean, on the one side, there's the JET program, or the Just Energy Transition program, that has been announced. and that's got its own aspirations around how we move from a high carbon economy into a low carbon economy. And then you've got our Minister of Electricity coming with a very different perspective on the very same thing. And so our President is addressing the JET program. Our Minister of Electricity addresses the JET program. What comes out of our Minister of Electricity is a suggestion that, of course,
Okay, Sifiso, unfortunately, we have lost our connection, but we're trying to reestablish it. So we're going to stay on the story and maybe just take a look, because we're talking about the 5th South Africa Investment Conference. The president, in his newsletter today, spoke about last week's conference, saying that it provided a huge boost to the country's digital economy. And he says, in addition to significant investment commitments in data and telecommunications infrastructure, there was also announcements about investments in the mining, manufacturing, energy, property, logistics, and food and beverages sector. Okay, so we've got Sifiso back on the line with us. So Sifiso, maybe let's just take a look at this as you were talking about policy cohesion. The president's newsletter today talking about that investment conference, but also talking about it being a huge boost to the digital economy. How would you characterize South Africa's digital economy? Or maybe let me just start 1.1. What is that?
I mean, I think it's a difficult one to say how big is our digital economy and what is our digital economy, to be quite honest. Do you look at broadcasting as part of that? Do you look at telecommunications as part of that? Do you look at fintechs as part of that? Do you look at the incumbents? Netflix coming into the country, Google coming into the country as also incumbents that are trying to participate in the space. We know they have also committed some investment into that space. So I think this kind of broad ICT convergence makes it difficult to size the digital economy as a whole. But I think the interesting developments that are happening there, and I think they must be welcome. We must look at the likes of Google in how they want to participate in our economy in supporting particularly SME development. We must look at the likes of Amazon, Netflix, etc. in terms of localizing productions and production spend in South Africa. We've got great sun hours in terms of natural light, even for the filming industry. These are some of the things I think for me that come into that digital industry that are very interesting developments that we certainly, I think, must also look at. How does our regulatory framework adjust with this fast-changing environment to be able to be conducive, I think, for the investment that some of these organizations do want to bring into our local economy as well.
Yeah, as we speak, it's the African Continental Free Trade Area meeting as well. I think we spoke about the visa regime or the visa system and the movement of people and allowing for greater movement of goods, because there's no movement of goods without movement of persons. But when we take a look at the African Continental Free Trade Area Act, I fear is sometimes said to be a useless emotion, but I do fear that perhaps this could just be another dream deferred, because a lot of steps that need to be taken to make it a reality. It would appear from the surface level, at least, that we're dragging our feet with it. What then is the point of all of these meetings, be it the investment conference, and yet you don't see the difference at ground level, or be it the African Continental Free Trade Area, but you don't see the difference? And it's been so many years that we've been talking about this.
Sure. I mean, I think the point you're making is such an important one around our inability to optimize our cooperation models, I think, as African countries to be able to, I think, to fast track our ambitions. I mean, there's some other projects. There's Great Lake Inga project that was supposed to be the biggest hydroelectricity project on the continent that could power up the whole continent, but you couldn't get the sensible level of cooperation between the Congo, Zambia, and some of the countries that are impacted by that water stream. And I think when we look at the Africa Free Continental Trade Area and the impetus there, I think nudges can be potentially an interesting future development there. And the nudges I'm talking about here, if you look at, for example, the car manufacturing industry, the UK has now set its own targets kicking off 2030 to 2035. around phasing out internal combustion engines, often called ICE. And therefore, when we think about our own manufacturing for vehicles, and Europe is one of the large destinations for our vehicles, maybe we can think about how do we take vehicles into the continent as an alternative, export destination, while we're trying to think about electric vehicles as well from a manufacturing point of view. And so those nudges could be quite important in galvanizing and accelerating how we're acting towards, I guess, really realizing value from this Africa Free Continental Trade Area and agreement thereof. And so certainly I think right now we definitely don't have many good stories to write as a continent in terms of our cooperation models. But certainly I think it is still an opportunity that is a live opportunity for us as a continent. And hopefully I think through these meetings that we certainly, I think, a little bit more honest with each other around what it truly means to have a sustainable cooperation model.
In fact, to your point, Yoweri Museveni put that on the table when he was here a few weeks ago. He said, well, Uganda makes electric vehicles. South Africa has got the mineral that we need, and so maybe we could collaborate. Just as a closing thought, maybe on the South Africa investment drive, this is not the last one. And so what is it that maybe you are looking forward to, a sticking point for you to make it better?
Dudu, I mean, I think sometimes we need to, of course, just be quite mindful about which countries we look at for case studies. And I think in the context of, I think, sectoral-based investment impetus, China has been very interesting. So they've got these 5-year cycles where they focus on one particular sector, and the emphasis is around growing the sector, incubating that growth, pumping, investment into that particular sector with a view around what that sector will do for kind of the future composition of their economy. I think when we are thinking about the next investment drive, I'd love to see a little bit more intentionality around where we think value will come from a sectoral point of view, so that then we can all galvanize and say, even from a skills development point of view, everyone, most of the skills must be invested towards that space. When we're thinking about incubating, we're thinking about sustainable financing. These are all the things that inform sustainable growth as well, need to come in with I think, a localized and also quite a myopic view around where sectorally we think that we can get realize, I think, competitive advantage, I think, from a global economy point of view. So I think for the next set of drives, if we are a little bit intentional at a sectoral level where we think growth can transform for the economy, I think there'll be good impetus then also in taking the conversation back to investors.
Intentional. Thank you very much. Sifiso Skenjana is an economist. Appreciate your time.